Bienvenidos a la Universidad de la Libertad. Esta es segunda llamada. Segunda. Esta es tercera llamada. Tercera.
Hola, muy buenas tardes a todos ustedes. Muchas gracias por estar presente en esta conferencia sobre innovación, progreso humano y superabundancia. Tenemos el gran privilegio el día de hoy de tener con nosotros al doctor Marian Tupy, que es el líder del proyecto de Human Progress en el Cato Institute. También es el coautor de este gran libro llamado Superabundancia. Yo tengo la versión en inglés, Superabundance, The Story of Population Growth, Innovation and Human Flourishing, on an Infinitely Bountiful Planet. Le vamos a estar preguntando de esto. Superabundance también está en español, ahora Superabundancia, que Marian seguramente se va a echar un comercial diciendo que lo pueden adquirir en Kindle. Y también es autor de este otro maravilloso libro, 10 Global Trends Every Smart Person Should Know. Y como todos aquí somos muy smart en la Universidad de la Libertad, pues entonces que nos diga qué es lo que tenemos que saber sobre las grandes tendencias. Este es parte de un ejercicio que en colaboración con varios de los líderes de la universidad. Aquí tenemos que destacar la presencia del rector Jorge Díaz Cuervo, Jorge siempre apoyando este tipo de diálogos y de conversaciones que son tan importantes, en donde puede haber disenso, puede haber disputa, puede haber diálogo, puede haber discusión, puede haber debate, pero de eso se trata, hablando se entiende la gente. Y qué mejor de poder hablar sobre estos temas con un experto que igual hoy está aquí en la Ciudad de México. Él viene del Festival de las Ideas, que se celebró en Puebla el fin de semana pasado, pero igual lo pueden encontrar en Australia la próxima semana y después se nos va a Estonia la semana subsiguiente y a través de todo Estados Unidos y de Canadá. Yo creo que, Marian, you probably live on an airplane, right? More than anything. Yo admiro muchísimo el talento y la aportación que nos ha dado Marian Tupy. Su presentación, que por cierto va a estar en YouTube, o creo que ya está montada en YouTube, su presentación en el Festival de las Ideas en Puebla, verdadera, fue, en mi opinión, una contribución importantísima para entender los temas de progreso humano, de innovación, de este concepto tan bonito, superabundancia. Así que yo lo estoy presentando en español, pero vamos ahora a hacer el típico Spanglish que a veces caracteriza las presentaciones aquí en la Universidad de la Libertad. And we're going to conduct this in English. Vamos a hablar aproximadamente unos 25, 30 minutos. entre él y yo, y después vamos a pasar a un diálogo con todos ustedes. Nuevamente muy agradecido a la Universidad de la Libertad, al rector Jorge Díaz Cuervo, a Irma por toda la gran coordinación de esta oportunidad y a todos ustedes de poder participar en esta conversación. So, Marian, to start it off, thank you so much for being here at this wonderful scenario, the Núcleo de la Libertad here at Universidad de la Libertad. I may ask perhaps my sister who's sitting in the front row to take a picture of us so I can send it to you via WhatsApp a little later on and others as well. So there's this massive book, Superabundance, that has received all kinds of reviews, some rave reviews, some other not so rave reviews. What is superabundance? Come on, an infinitely bountiful planet? What are you trying to say in this book that is so important to understand concepts like human flourishing and innovation?
Well, not just smart people, but a lot of smart people, but general public tends to believe that when you have more people in the world, resources must become more scarce. So it's like, think about it this way. If you have 5 people to dinner, and it's a pizza on the table, everybody will get a certain slice. But if you have 10 people and still just 1 pizza, everybody will have to have a smaller slice. And most people think that life, the world, functions like dinner with 1 pizza, right? The more people you have, the smaller the slices get. But that's not what we found. What we found in superabundance is that the more people you have, the slices are not getting smaller, they're getting bigger. Resources are falling in price relative to income. And that's because people are not just consumers, but they're also creators. So yes, we need the resources to survive and to flourish, but we're also creating resources all the time, which is why today, relative to income, Mexicans, Americans, Canadians, pretty much everybody in the world pays much less than they used to. Things have become much more abundant. Superabundance has a technical meaning, which is whenever resources are getting more abundant than the population growth, we call that superabundance. So abundance can be growing at 2 speeds, lower than population growth or higher than population growth. And in pretty much everything we looked at in the book, it's growing at a faster pace than population growth. And that tells us that on average, every human being contributes more than they consume.
Now, there must be a series of factors that are behind a superabundant curve, right? One that where you see a greater abundance of resources than population growth. In Puebla, you said population growth has actually been the highest in the past, what, 30 years or 50 years?
Well, the population of the world has grown from 1 billion in 1800 to 8 billion in 2022 or 2023. So the world's population in the last 200 years has expanded 8-fold, and GDP per capita in the world over the same period of time has increased from about $2 per person per day to about $40 per person per day. So, the more people we have, the richer we are.
And yet we're not in the pizza situation where we have less.
No, I mean, let me give you a typical example. So per every acre of land where we sow rice or corn or wheat, we now get much more than we used to. Why? Well, partly because we have created new types of corn or wheat or rice, which can yield much more than they used to. So the point is that we create resources all the time, such as increased agricultural productivity, and also innovation and productivity gains, such as that it costs much less today to bring in the harvest than it used to. 1,000 years ago, or even 200 years ago, you needed hundreds of workers in order to plow the fields, sow the grain, bring it home, bring the harvest home. Now you have combine harvesters with GPS and whatever else. All of those productivity increases mean that we have more food, which means that food can become cheaper for more people. Did that make any sense?
Well, yeah, but and I want you to go back to the other marvelous concept of time prices, which I think is so important. A little bit technical, but I think it's very, very important to understand. And yet, if I put myself on the position of the layperson, there's several that will say, come on, man, look at prices today, look at inflation, and there's not enough, no hay suficiente en el bolsillo de la gente. There's not enough in my purchasing power today to acquire what I used to perhaps in 1980 or in 1990. Is that true?
Every generation in every country you can think of, people have this notion that things used to be cheaper. And they were, in a sense that if you were living in the United States in 1960s, gas, petrol, what do you call it here, gasolina?
Gasolina.
Was maybe 6 cents, right? And today it's $3 or $4.
That's called gasolinazo.
Gasolinas. The problem was that back in 1960s, people were only earning $1 an hour, and now they are earning 25. So people remember prices. The fact that gasolina was only 6 cents and now it's $4. They don't remember what happened to their wages, which grow over time, right? So in order to show whether population growth results in greater resource scarcity or greater resource abundance, we wanted to take it as far back as possible. And we were able to take it back to 1850. But when you start looking a century and a half back, the problem is that, you know, some of the currencies that people had back then are no longer functional. You don't know what the inflation rates were, what the exchange rates were. So we forget about dollars and cents. We don't deal with dollars and cents or pesos.
Purchasing power parity and such.
Purchasing power parities and all that stuff. We don't deal with that at all. We ask, what could an average Mexican get for an hour of labor in 1980, and then compare it to today? And when we looked at that, what we saw was that a typical Mexican gets 70% more today than he or she did in 1980, okay? So when you look at things like meat, fuel, food, minerals, metals, your typical Mexican for an hour of work gets about 70% more today than he or she did in 1980. And Mexico was the worst performing country of all the countries that we looked at, which was 37, accounting for about 85% of GDP. China, of world GDP, China was the best performer. In China, over those 38 years, the Chinese have increased their standards of living by 40 times. Not 70% like in Mexico, but 4,000%.
So let me take...
So those are the time prices. Yeah, if a loaf of bread in Mexico costs 100 pesos and you are making 100 pesos, that means you have to work for an hour in order to buy your loaf of bread, okay? The time price is 1 hour of labor. But if in 2 years' time the loaf of bread is still 100 pesos, but you are making 200 pesos, then it's only 30 minutes. And that's how we calculate whether standards of living have improved or decreased.
So two important questions surrounding this is, what are the conditions that create maximum superabundance? And to that, let me again do the devil's advocate. So China is the one that has increased by how much?
4,000%.
4,000%. So communism is not so bad, maybe.
No. China has abandoned totalitarian communist central planning in 1978. With Deng Xiaoping, there were economic reforms in China. It's very difficult for us to imagine what life was like in China in the 1960s and 1970s. It was a totalitarian society. I'm not talking authoritarian. You know, Mexico in the bad old days was authoritarian. I'm talking totalitarian, where the government controls every single aspect of your life, including who you can marry, how many children you can have, what kind of jobs you do. Government controls everything. So by the government abandoning totalitarian communism in exchange for just authoritarian fascism, which is what China is today, they were able to release these innovative, these entrepreneurial impulses of the Chinese people. Basically, in China, so long as you don't have any opinion on politics and you don't talk about politics, you can do anything you want.
Anything you want.
And that's what, in some ways, it's more deregulated than the United States.
Wow. Now,
but you cannot say anything about politics, because then you get shot.
Yeah, well, I hope some of our nations don't go that way. Certainly one that has gone that way is Venezuela, for instance. So sure. Again, I don't mean to say it as a counterexample, but here is a country that has an abundance of resources. tremendous people, tremendous human capital, and yet 95% of its population today does not live in superabundance. They live in poverty or extreme poverty.
That's correct.
So what lesson for superabundance could we derive from this in terms of culture of innovation, economic freedom, and other such concepts?
Just as an anecdote or a little factoid, GDP per capita in Venezuela in 1952 was higher than the United States. Okay?
In 1952.
1951, 52. For about 2 or 3 years, Venezuela was richer per capita than the United States. Today, of course, it's a failed state, pretty much. So, obviously, just having more people is not enough. Or rather, maybe I should say it this way. The fundamental reason for prosperity and for superabundance is innovation. Okay? There are 2 rates of economic growth as identified by the economic historian Joel Mokyr. There is the Smithian economic growth, and then there's the Schumpeterian economic growth. Smithian economic growth is basically about division of labor. If I was making these shoes on my own, I would make fewer shoes than if you were making the shoelaces, I was making the the leather here, and if we divide labor, we can increase our productivity. That's the Smithian growth. Schumpeterian growth is if you replace all of us with a machine, with innovation, right? If you can get a machine, then the improvements in productivity are not 2-fold or 3-fold, but maybe 3,000% or 4,000% or 5,000%. So innovation, which really means automatization, the ultimate innovation is automatization, taking the human being out of it, because the human being is usually the most expensive part of the production process. And by handing it over to machines, which don't need to eat, which don't need to drink, which don't need healthcare costs, etc. And so it is innovation, the Schumpeterian innovation, which really is behind this extraordinary growth that the world has experienced. But innovation doesn't arise out of nothing. First you need people. Only people can have ideas, which then you can turn into inventions and innovations. So you need that. But you also need freedom. Institutions, which, and by freedom, I really mean everything from institutions which protect your right to free thinking and free speech and free publication and free association, to your freedom to invest, to profit, to keep the products of your labor. So superabundance really means population times freedom. That's how you get to superabundance.
Very well. Again, not to push the role of a devil's advocate. Last Monday, we had here a remarkable duo of entrepreneurs, Matthew and Michael Vega, that also went to Festival de las Ideas, and they shared this platform called Gale, which is basically an artificial intelligence platform that substitutes a call center.
Yes.
So if today, as an insurance broker or whatever, you have a call center of 40 people, 35 people, and now I have a platform that doesn't eat and doesn't sleep, right? And where it costs me so much a year, and I don't have to think about Social Security and about overhead and about benefits and about how many vacation days. But all those people are going to lose their jobs. So Schumpeterian innovation, sometimes called creative destruction as well, which is creative is great, but destruction is not so great. What happens to all those jobs and what can be done? What should we be thinking about? How to answer the knee-jerk reaction that the technological revolution, and especially artificial intelligence, is going to leave notary publics, is going to leave lawyers, even medics, without a job.
So, first of all, not everything can be automatized, certainly not in the short to medium term. Even things like, certainly when it comes to matters where human beings have to be involved, say childcare or healthcare sector, we are very far away from a moment when a robot can perform a surgery or can take care of a child while you are away. We have many, many decades over which robotics and AI, it really is the combination of robotics and AI which could potentially result in a place where humans are no longer necessary. Now, okay, so first thing, don't panic. in 1900, in the year 1900, 40% of all Americans were involved in agriculture. 40% of Americans were
40%?
in 1900, 40% of Americans were in agriculture. Today, 1.5%. And America not just feeds the United States, but much of the world. The point is that you didn't suddenly have 38.5% unemployment. Suddenly you had manufacturing jobs and you had services jobs, okay? Secondly, when you had the IT revolution in the 1990s, people were also worried that computers would take away people's jobs. No, all that happened was suddenly you needed to have an IT department to make sure that the photocopier worked, right? So the application of technology actually led to the development and creation of brand new industries. So there is no reason to think that AI itself will immediately have such negative effects, will have such profound effects. It has never, in other words, it has never happened before when we transitioned from agriculture to manufacturing, then to services, then to IT, that suddenly everybody was unemployed. So that's point number one. Secondly, adoption of technologies usually takes decades, very many decades. It took 50 years for electricity to really penetrate, you know, all of the United States, maybe even longer. And so we have a lot of time in which to adjust. Thirdly, not all things will be subject to the AI revolution. And fourthly, you can play a sort of logical game. If you can combine robots and AI and have everything done by the robots driven by AI, then that also means that almost everything will be done freely. So we could end up with a population of people who are poets or painters or read books or lecture and whatever else, but they will be tended to by an army of AI-driven robots. But it doesn't really matter because everything will be free, because the way you get things to be free is by automatizing them.
Wow. Well, Marx talked about a utopia where I could be a fisherman in the morning and I can play basketball in the afternoon and I can be a philosopher at night. And that's supposed to be communism.
Well,
again, I don't mean to play the devil's
you're
advocate
not.
here, but it came to my mind that maybe with these technologies, eventually I have a lot more time for leisure in libraries.
Yes, but you get through, if you ever get to it, if we ever get to it, it will be through the market, through people competing against one another, companies competing against one another, technologies competing against one another. Marx was thinking about central planning. I'm not advocating for central planning. I don't think that we can get into the world of abundance through central planning. We can only get to it by you having an idea and then the market selecting between your idea and my idea and getting rid of what's bad and adopting what's good. That's the only way in which we can come up with all the innovations and technologies that are going to bring about superabundance. So the deregulated part of the market, the competition between ideas, is actually fundamental to getting to that point if we ever get there. One last point. Are we ever going to get there? I don't know. It's such a long-term view, plus human needs are infinite. So are we ever going to be in a happy place where everything is going to be free and where the machines are going to tend to all of our needs, or our needs are just going to expand exponentially? The point is, if our needs are exponential and our needs are infinite, then probably even full robotics with AI is not going to meet them, and there will always be some scope for human labor.
El proyecto de superabundancia está relacionado a otro proyecto llamado Progreso Humano en el Cato Institute, que han hecho cuáles son las experiencias de progreso humano, varias de las cuales Marian ya nos compartió, pero también lo tratan de relacionar cuáles son las condiciones de progreso humano, qué países han capturado más progreso humano. Y ahí es donde otro gran proyecto que tienen, el índice de libertad humana, no solo libertad económica, sino todas las libertades, política, social, libertad civil. So this is closely linked to that remarkable project also at Cato Institute, the Human Freedom Index. And the Human Freedom Index perhaps goes into the idea of what are the places that have those institutions that protect those freedoms where human progress and certainly that superabundant curve are more likely to happen?
Yeah, so that's the project of my colleague Ian Vasquez, and I would encourage you all to look at it. Human Freedom Index focuses on negative liberty rather than positive liberty. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but basically Isaiah Berlin's distinction between positive and negative liberty. Negative liberty basically means that you are allowed to pursue your dreams without the government or your fellow men standing in your way. Negative liberty basically means that you are left alone to do as you please, so long as you don't compromise rights of others. Positive liberty, which really starts in the United States in the 1930s, is your right to things, right to education, right to housing, right to healthcare. And of course, what tends to happen is that the more positive liberty you have, the less negative liberty you have, and the less negative liberty you have, the less growth you have.
There's this other book that you published with Ron Bailey from Reason, the science editor of Reason magazine. And this came out in 2020.
2020,
If I
yeah.
Actually, I was at the presentation. I commented on a presentation of Ron a week before the pandemic hit in Guatemala. And we were discussing, it was forthcoming, 10 global trends. Beautifully illustrated book. What are some of these 10 global trends, for instance, in energy? You've talked about hydrogen. I've heard you talk about hydrogen as a new source of energy. Also nuclear, which tends to scare us, you know, thinking of nuclear energy. Or the great enrichment, or what, among 10 global trends, why don't you give us a taste of 2 or 3 cool trends that we should know here at Universidad La Libertad?
Well, first of all, the illustrators were one from Argentina and one from Chile, so that's a South American production. Okay, so the most important trends, life expectancy. For tens of thousands of years, people lived to about 25 to 30. Today, life expectancy around the world is about 73 years. In the United States, it's 76 years. In other countries like Hong Kong, it's 88 years. So the point is that we have twice as much life, sometimes 3 times as much life as we used to. We used to die really young, and I think if you enjoy living like I do, I love traveling and exploring new countries, then being alive for longer is a good idea, at least it seems to me. The other thing which is, I think, very important, you know, people used to be hungry all the time. It's not just that people used to die by tens of millions due to famines, but hunger was an omnipresent problem everywhere. And today, our big problem is obesity. So that gives you a sense of how much we have progressed. Child mortality. As late as 1750, 50% of children in Sweden died before their 15th birthday. Let me repeat that, 50.
Wow.
Half of all children, and that was normal. 50% of children die before the age of 15 in the hunter-gathering societies, or in 1800 in Bavaria. So about half the children. A woman could expect to lose half of their children. Today, the global average is 4%, and in places like the Nordic countries, it's 0.3%. So those are some of the examples of how extraordinarily lucky we are to be living today.
I did mention energy, so you got to tell
so
us,
energy,
why do you think nuclear energy can be an important source or an important global trend in the future?
Well, no matter how you feel about the environment and no matter how much you want windmills and solar, you will always need backup power. And that backup power, base power, can only come from coal, which produces a lot of CO2. It can come from gas, natural gas, which produces 50% as much CO2 as coal. In other words, only half as much. Or it can come from nuclear fission, which produces no CO2, right? But you will have to have one of these, because whenever the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow, you need to switch to a power backup. In the United States, we have a lot of, we are phasing out coal, replacing it with natural gas, which is not good enough for Democrats. They want to get rid of that, but in the US, it's either going to be gas or nuclear fission. And then the ultimate goal is going to be nuclear fusion. So instead of splitting atoms, you are going to smash atoms together. And that has the potential of unleashing cheap and plentiful energy. Well, I don't know if it's going to be cheap. Obviously, we hope that it's going to be cheap, but it's potentially an unlimited amount of energy. And if it's cheap enough, then we don't ever have to run out of anything, because if you have fusion, meaning smashing atoms together, then you can also produce any elements you want. Let me unpack that a little bit. The Big Bang only created hydrogen and a little bit of lithium and helium. Those are the lightest elements in the periodic table. Everything else that we have on Earth, gold, platinum, iron, has been created inside stars through the process of fusion. Different temperatures, different pressures have turned these atoms of hydrogen into gold, platinum, etc. And when those stars exploded, they seeded the universe with all the elements which we find on Earth. So nothing on Earth is really natural. It was produced inside other stars, and then Earth, through gravity, has come to possess those. But the fact is that if you have fusion and if you have hydrogen, then you can create any element you want. So you don't ever have to run out of anything.
Chemical economics, I guess, would be.
Economics and physics.
And physics. Un poquito de todo. Hayek used to say, of course, he or she who only knows economics knows very little economics. So it's important to be well informed about other disciplines. Two more questions before lending the microphone to the floor here and to those who may want to converse with you. But one of them is, as far as innovation is concerned, and you got to put your futuristic hat and tell us, what cool new thing do you expect that we should be on the lookout for as far as innovation trends? Where does Marian Tupy think the next great big wow is going to be?
Well, I'm really quite hopeful about AI, and not just because it's popular, but because I follow the literature and the breakthroughs and the things that the models are already capable of doing. Supercomputing and AI, the advances in healthcare, for example, that we could achieve are absolutely tremendous.
Does that longevity from 76 could go up to 100?
Absolutely, and even longer. AI could potentially, and supercomputing could potentially help us to discover new cancer drugs. Protein folding, which I don't quite understand, but apparently it's incredibly difficult to understand the structure of different proteins. AI can do that in minutes. Discovering new drugs and new vaccines can be done, again, in minutes or hours. Running the entire process of discovering whether a drug is actually going to be safe for a human being. Again, you just plug in all the different genetic databases that we have with AI and a new drug structure, and you can figure out whether this is going to be safe for human consumption, so that you don't have to wait 8 months before the development of the COVID vaccine and the first shots which were given to people. Maybe it can be done in hours.
What's going to happen to the Drug Enforcement Administration?
Well, the sooner we are rid of it, the better. But the point is that I think there is tremendous. Okay, let's look at something else. Let's look at compound materials. A compound materials is if you combine 2 different elements to create a compound material, okay? So for example, if you combine tin and copper, you get bronze. Brilliant. Who was it? Fantastic. So to combine copper and tin, you get bronze. But because there is 100 elements in the table, over 100, but let's just use 100. In order to get to two compound element that works, you may have to do up to 9,000 calculations, 100 times 99, okay? Now, we got bronze, which then gave rise to the Bronze Age because of a lucky accident. Somebody just put tin and copper together, they came up with bronze, and they say, Eureka, We have the first age, and we are going to call it Bronze Age. But if you were doing it in a lab, you might have to try 9,000 different calculations, 100 times 99, until you get to a useful one. When you start combining, when you think about combining 4 compounds, then the number of calculations is 10 million. If you are thinking about 10 compounds, 10 element compounds, the number of possible calculations is bigger than the number of seconds since the Big Bang 14.5 billion years ago. So that tells you that if we were just going to try things out, combining this element with that element to see what we come up with at different temperatures and different pressures, we would need trillions of people and trillions of years in order to figure out what works and what doesn't. AI could potentially do this in hours. And that's the great promise of AI. New compounds which will enable us to create airplanes which are much lighter, much more energy efficient, much faster, much safer, all sorts of other things.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to think about that. Here at Universidad de la Libertad, we try and think this way, and one of the great lemmas is mentes inconformes inquietas, minds that are uneasy, perpetually uneasy, and are always never give up, and are always trying to find new ways, and always thinking about how to remove obstacles or how to free obstacles. What is your opinion of Universidad de la Libertad?
I'm a huge
better
fan,
say something
and
nice,
I wish
I
you
think.
all the best. Well, first of all, you are in very beautiful surroundings. Seems like you have very intelligent and knowledgeable people.
Acaba de estar en un fireside chat con unos 5 o 6 de todos ustedes, por eso lo dice.
So
How was the fireside chat experience?
It was great. I enjoyed it very much.
Okay.
And I wish you all the best. I really hope that you can make a huge success out of this.
Well, we certainly hope you come back and when the 11th global trend or some such and be able to share these wonderful experiences. Let's open it up to questions and answers or comments, concerns, issues, debates, maybe even a little dissent from the floor.
Please don't be shy.
Yes, please don't be shy. We have Pedro Lopez Cela over here, Jorge Díaz Cuervo, and I guess I'll lend you my microphone.
I'm really enjoying the book, by the way. Roberto recommended it.
Thank you.
I drank the Abundance Kool-Aid many years ago with Peter Diamandis. So what I was telling some friends is that actually, I haven't finished yet, by the way, but I found it very valuable that you're documenting the numbers aside from the speech. So I really appreciate that. What I haven't come across yet is information about sustainability. I do understand that we're more productive. I do understand that we're earning more. And all the different economic topics that you approach, I think they're very valuable. But what's your view on the future of the raising of temperature, particle emissions to the atmosphere, plastics in the ocean?
Right. Well, the first thing to remember is that there is a high correlation between GDP per capita and environmental quality. Basically, the richer the country, the cleaner the environment. This is not just me speaking. These regressions have been done by the Yale Environmental Protection Index. You can just plug it into computer, Google it right now if you don't believe me. This is the Yale University Environmental Protection Index. It is not run by free marketers. They looked at environmental quality, they looked at GDP, and there is a clear, the richer the country, the better the environment. The air is definitely cleaner than it ever was, certainly in Western countries. That it has been since before the Industrial Revolution. Our rivers are very clean now. The ocean pollution really originates in developing countries. In 8 rivers in China and Asia account for about 19% of all the trash that goes into the oceans, which is what you would expect, because when you start industrializing and when you start becoming richer, people usually do a tremendous amount of damage to the environment. We did that in Europe and in the United States. People are now doing it in China and India. But there is an environmental Kuznets curve whereby at some point people start realizing that environment matters, and they are rich enough to start paying for better environment in higher taxes and better protection. The acreage, or the amount of land and ocean which is now safe from human exploitation because of natural parks, because of fishing-free zones, is now higher than it has ever been. Something like 15% of the world's oceans are now protected, 15% of land mass and 30% of oceans are now protected from overfishing and from human excursion. So again, when you're a richer country, you can better take care of your animals, you can have more land saved for the animals, you can take care of them, you can have all sorts of groups devoted to protecting animals. And hopefully, look, right now, at this point in time, there is no reason why a single species should go extinct. There is enough money and enough focus and enough environmental awareness, certainly in rich countries, so that we should never have to run out of anything anymore. And who knows, maybe in the future we'll be able to bring some animals back. The other thing which is through genetic engineering. The other thing which is working in our favor is urbanization. Already over 50% of humanity live in the cities, and by the year 2050, 80% of humanity will be living in the cities. And that's what you want, because cities create more innovation. When people are together, they create more innovation. Cities consume less resources per capita than rural areas. And thirdly, you want to get people away from the land. The most destructive force for the land and for animals is the presence of human beings. So if we can get people from the city, from the rural areas to the cities, to urban areas, and if we can increase our agricultural productivity so that we can create more food on less land, then the amount of land that can be returned to nature will be just growing in time. And there is no reason why that shouldn't happen. Already in Western countries, we are post-peak agricultural use, meaning that we are getting ever more food per less land because we become so productive that we can just increase the amount of food grown per acre of land.
Gracias, Pedro.
This is a very long answer, but it's a very complicated and a very complicated question.
Jorge.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Marian, for visiting Universidad de la Libertad, and thank you, Roberto, for making this happen. Language, words, and concepts are very important. And for us that study economics, business, finance, scarcity is a very strong concept. It's a concept that is very common. Could you please elaborate on superabundance? Because it kind of contrasts with what we've already been thinking of and trying to resolve, the scarcity of resources. And then you talk about superabundance. It's kind of a revolution in terms of how we see the world. Can you elaborate on the concept of superabundance?
Well, in the book, we didn't want to measure scarcity because scarcity is infinite. You can always have more of something, right? So if you have a 4-bedroom apartment, do you have scarcity of living space because your desire is to have a 5-bedroom apartment? If you have 1 car in the garage, but you want 2. No, the point is that there's always going to be scarcity in a sense that our needs are always going to be greater than what we have. Every one of us wants to have more than what we have, therefore everything will always be scarce. So, and therefore you cannot really measure it. I want to go for a weekend to the moon. How do you measure that? That kind of idea. But abundance can be measured. If to buy a chicken, a Mexican now works 15 minutes less than he worked 5 years ago, that can be measured. Abundance can be measured. You can measure how much better off a typical Mexican is in terms of his access to resources, be it fuel, metal, mineral, food. And in those areas where the market is allowed to function, like the production of food, for example, things are generally becoming cheaper. Now, there are certain areas where the market is not allowed to function, where things are becoming much more expensive. For example, in Britain, if you look at the United Kingdom and the price of gasoline or electricity, it's been falling for over a century. Then in 2000, goes back up. How did that happen? Why did that happen? It had nothing to do with the market. The government simply started regulating energy production so that, you know, in Britain today, the energy mix that you are buying from the energy supplier needs to have a certain percentage of wind, electricity, and solar electricity, and so on, so it's becoming much more expensive. But where the market is allowed to happen, things allowed to function, things generally become much cheaper over time. And so in superabundance, we start off by measuring 50 most important commodities traded in the world, everything from chickens and bananas and oranges to uranium and copper and gas and oil and so on. And you know, we have seen superabundance everywhere we looked. And again, just to reemphasize, there is a technical definition of superabundance, which is that things are becoming cheaper at a higher rate than population growth. So if population of Mexico is growing 2% a year, but resources getting more abundant at 3% a year, we call that superabundance. And that's in fact what's happening. Because once again, the book was intended, the book's main intention was to try to discern the relationship between resources and population. If you have more people, is the pizza getting smaller or is it getting bigger? It turns out it's getting bigger.
We have a few more questions up here.
Yes.
Sí.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I have a question. Which is your opinion about post-humanism?
What is my opinion about humanism?
Post-humanism.
Oh, post-humanism. Oh, look, I'm a classical liberal / libertarian, so if you want to merge your mind with a computer, you should have the right to do that. Transhumanism. I think the word is transhumanism. Yeah.
Transhumanism.
You know,
okay.
again, I think that your body is yours. If you were to download your mind into a computer, then by all means.
Kind of like the Matrix, or?
Well, kind of. I mean, many of these people are looking for eternal life, and they are worrying that we are not going to get to it before they die. And so, like Walt Disney, for example, had his head cut off and put in a freezer. That's one way to do it. The other way is to try to get your memories and basically your brain downloaded into... it's a big task, but I mean, here's the thing. The brain functions, what are they, the synopsis? Is it the synopsis? Okay. So there are something like 6 trillion of them, like firing in your brain at any point in time. Okay, so if supercomputing could get to a point to mirror the computing power of the human brain, then it should be theoretically possible to download your mind into a computer and then live forever that way. The big question is whether people in the future will want to interact with somebody like you. Not you, because you're brilliant, obviously. But.
Or shut you off all completely.
Yeah, I mean, why would these super intelligent human beings 5,000 years from now want to communicate with me?
Right.
What do I have to tell them? They don't already know.
Well, the superabundance. A ver, otra pregunta. Alberto Palma y después acá arriba. Gracias. Adelante, Adalberto.
Gracias. In this stage of my life, I have decided I cannot be a pessimist. However, I have serious difficulties to be an optimist. So I have decided to be a romanticist. And my conviction is that if you're in the right company, maybe you can be hopeful. Here, I feel in the right company. However, what you decide and you're saying, I have a very conflicting thought about what is going on, because I think that hopefulness is not around. I don't know if it's a matter of perception, reality, or wishful thinking, but the mood is not very hopeful. What's your feeling about that?
Well, I have three responses. One is that romantics, of course, did a huge damage to human progress because romanticism was, of course, a counter-reaction to Enlightenment. Second point is that there's nothing guaranteed in what I'm saying. I am a rational optimist.
Can you explain rational optimism in the sense?
In a sense that when you look at human past and look at what we have overcome, the extraordinary, believe it or not, I mean, you may think that Mexico is still a developing country or a middle-income country or whatever you want to call it, but compared to much of the rest of the world, this is a rich country. You know, if you compare yourself even to Brazilians, it's very so. So the point is that we have accomplished a lot. We have overcome diseases, we have overcome child mortality, we have overcome deep ignorance, and even people who are in the middle of the income pack worldwide are living lives that our ancestors could only. So the point is that when you look at the past human accomplishment, you think, well, if we have overcome all those things with much more primitive technology and much less wisdom, why can't we be rationally optimistic about the future and expect that we are going to resolve those problems, future problems also? One of the reasons why I'm a huge fan of economic growth and technological innovation is because we don't know what sort of problems are going to face humanity 10 years or 100 years or 1,000 years from now. And so the more technologically advanced society you have, the more likely it is that we'll be able to tackle those things. So anyway, I'm a rational optimist because I think that we can resolve problems in the future. However, so I'm not Pollyannish. I don't believe that we already live in a perfect world, and nor do I believe that there is some sort of a force in the universe which is going to make everything good. We could still blow up the world with nuclear weapons. You know, we could still have an asteroid destroy the world, which is why I hope that we are technologically advanced to be able to...
New terrorist attacks?
New terrorist attacks, bioweapons. So the point is that I've never said that anything is guaranteed, that there is not. The last point, I'm finally getting to your last point. Forgive me, I'm long-winded today. I think there's a problem here, and that is that neoclassicists would call what's happening in media today a market failure. Since I'm not a neoclassical economist, I would simply call it a human failure. Basically, what's happening here is that the nature of news reportage and the competition within the news area means that you only going to hear the worst about what's happening in the world. The competition between newspapers and television, and especially the internet, we have evolved to look out for negative news because everything in the world could kill us until like 5 seconds ago. And so we have negativity biases, and what grabs our attention first is the negative news. The media knows this, which is why they always lead with the negative news. And because of the competition between different types of media, the more negative news you can produce and the more horrific headlines you have, the more likely it is that you are going to get a part of the viewership. So basically there is a deterioration to the bottom where, well, I mean, we already have studies which are showing that every inclusion of every additional negative word in a headline increases your click-through rate by 2.5%. So that's the problem. Is that nobody is exposed to the positive news, which is why we run Human Progress. All you get in the media is negative news because that is what competition dictates that you should lead with, because people are fundamentally not interested in things that can improve their lives. They're interested in things that can harm them. Bad is much stronger than good. Well, because we have evolved in a certain way. We have lived in good times for roughly, well, in the Western world for maybe 150 years, in the rest of the world maybe for 50 years. We have lived in modern times, in times when we are not starving or seeing our children die, etc. But for the first 300,000 of years as Homo sapiens, and millions of years before then as Homo erectus and Australopithecines, we have lived in a world where everything could eat us or kill us. Negativity is in our genes. And so we live in a world which is much better, but we don't know how to relate to it because our genes are living in a world where you are constantly at the risk of being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger.
Perdón, nada más una nota de fina al comentario de don Adalberto. Adalberto, I think, meant romanticism romantic, not romanticist, but romantic, as giving free wind to fantasies, to dreams, to the supernatural, to provocación, tanto en las expresiones artísticas como literatura. And that's actually seems quite consistent with, hey, you know, superabundance is actually something that we could write a Harry Potter book about.
Okay, then we have discovered language. The thing is, when I hear romantics, I'm thinking
lost
about
in translation.
Rousseau, you know.
But I think that's, by the way, Adalberto is one of Mexico's most important thought leaders in innovation today. So maybe there's more in common in that way of thinking about.
Yeah, well, here's what I was driving at, and that is that the Enlightenment thought that there was such a thing as an objective reality, that by science and reason and experimentation you could get to have an answer to almost anything. Now, if you are in the business of innovation, improving the world, you want to believe that there are real answers to real problems, right? And basically I think that romanticism, not your romanticism, French romanticism and German romanticism specifically, they embraced the unreasoned, the irrational, the emotional, rather than the logical and the empirical.
Where this is more like the art of the impossible, or like in Puebla we were talking how to make the impossible possible, which many of these technological discoveries have, you know, Elon Musk thinks he's going to get to the Mars by 2030. I don't think that's going to happen, but hey, he's Elon Musk, right? And thinking in those terms, well, it can be really cool. Perdón, ahora sí. Adelante.
No pasa nada. First of all, I am glad to have you here. And this question is more going for know more about you. And what's your motivation for writing this book and why you're addressing the issue of overabundance?
Thank you.
What was your motivation for writing this book? ¿Y qué más?
And why he had the issue of writing about addressing overabundance.
Tell us the story behind superabundance.
Well, okay, so with the Industrial Revolution, humans have done a great deal of damage to the planet, and there was a space in the 1960s and 1970s for an environmental movement which tried to balance the needs of the planet with the needs of the human beings. Before, we didn't care very much about the environment. Then we were trying to get some sort of a balance. But what I have noticed in the last 20 years, especially since the new millennium, was that that balance was being lost again. But now it was shifting too much toward the environment. The environmentalists of the last 20 years were no longer interested in balancing human needs with needs of the planet. They were beginning to see human beings as a cancer on the planet. They were beginning to see every child as an imposition. A lot of people in the West believe that you cannot bring your child into the world because the child will create CO2 emissions. There are philosophical movements in the West that are advocating in favor of, as I describe in the book, in favor of dehumanization, getting rid of all humans in the world, basically that humans should stop existing and that only animals should exist in the world. So I saw the environmental movement changing from perfectly acceptable and welcome sort of ideological movement to something that was anti-human, anti-natalist, almost almost genocidal. And there are many different ways in which the environmentalist movement behaves like that. One of them is the catastrophe of the climate change. They believe this is an existential crisis. But the other one is natural resources, that we are going to be using too much and therefore we should have fewer people. So that was my motivation behind it.
A ver, aquí hay otra pregunta. Creo que tenemos unos 10 minutos más, así que tranquilos.
Hi. What's your thought about the pandemic of COVID-19 and like from a point of view of genocidium and such a
O sea, ¿que alguien se lo inventó o qué?
like a population control?
Oh, okay. So I'm not a specialist on this. As a concerned citizen.
No, that's a good question. That's a good.
Yeah, I mean, as a concerned citizen, I am worried that this may have been a result of an escape from a lab. I am worried that this may have been a deliberate attempt by the Chinese and American scientists to create a new virus. I think we know pretty much that there was research on making the coronavirus stronger, paid for by the American taxpayer, but made in China, and that then there's a very high chance that then it escaped from a Chinese lab. I don't believe. I've seen no evidence, and therefore I'm not willing to entertain the idea that this was deliberate. I think that it's much more likely that it was an accidental release. But what concerns me most is that very few people are actually interested in finding out what really happened. I'm really concerned that that neither American government, nor the Chinese government, nor the WHO is really making a lot of effort in order to finding out what exactly happened, and that worries me because that could also be repeated in the future. So I think there is enough of a. So do I think it was deliberate? No, I don't. At least I haven't seen any evidence. Do I think that it is likely that it escaped from a Chinese lab? Yes, I think it's likely.
What do you think of Matt Ridley's explanation that there are three certain things in life: death, taxes, and pandemics? And he thinks they actually came from a Chinese wet market. And well, you've heard his explanation. You know Matt Ridley's book.
I am familiar with it. I mean, Matt. By the way, I thought it was death, taxes, and a German counterattack.
But Germany beating England in the World Cup final.
But no, sorry, this is a little historian joke there. But no, I mean, I follow Matt closely. I believe that Matt is one of the most honest and smartest people alive, and Matt believes that there is a non-zero chance, in fact, an increasing probability, that this was an escaped, that this was a virus that was artificially engineered for scientific purposes, not killing people, but for scientific purposes. It was a coronavirus that was spiked with this, well, that was artificially enhanced because scientists wanted to know how to actually prevent further pandemics. But instead, what happened was that the virus escaped and then infected and killed 11 million people. So no, I think this is what Matt is really saying, isn't it? And Matt, I think, is a true scholar. And what upsets Matt more than anything else is that so many scientists appear not to be interested in learning the truth and are stonewalling. And this is very concerning, because if you cannot trust scientists to go after the truth, then who can you trust? Certainly not politicians.
Well, especially given the reactions that they had in terms of confinement policies and.
Look, we already know there were things going on in the United States which were very murky. When Fauci and Collins were sending emails, suppress this study. This is science? I mean, insanity.
Yeah, well, we have our own version here with Don Hugo López Gatell.
Fauci was before Congress and he was asked, where did the 6-foot rule come from? He said, we just sort of made it up. There was no science behind it.
Sí. Ah, no, ya, ¿verdad? ¿Alguien más?
Aquí, Roberto. To your right.
Me perdí.
Up.
Adelante.
Good evening. When you were citing advances in the past 100 or so years, especially in Western countries, my reflection is that arguably many of the advances you cited, for example, protection of natural areas, that sort of thing, are a result, or at least arguably, of regulation, or perhaps arguably political markets. On the other hand, there's regulatory capture and a lot of things where we would rather prefer not to have regulation to be captured. What role does regulation play in this, and how do you think we can avoid the worst of it?
You know, I don't know how my fellow libertarians would feel about it, but I think that, you know, some regulation, certainly the regulation that came online in the much of the regulation that came online in the 1970s was perfectly fine. What tended to happen was that the government regulations were just a little bit above where the market was already. So it was pushing, for example, car emissions in a certain direction, but at a very incremental rate. But there wasn't a sense in the 1970s that you should shut down economic progress altogether, that you shouldn't build anything, that you shouldn't produce more energy, or that you should put on a hair shirt. There were also many bad regulations which came out of the 1970s, such as, for example, the American regulation of our nuclear industry. So I guess my argument would be, yes, there was good regulation and there was bad regulation, and as always happens, regulation over time grew so much, and it was captured so much that ultimately we ended up in a place where even the left in America understands that right now, as things stand, we cannot build anything, we cannot create anything, everything is forbidden. Overshoot. That was basically my argument to the previous question, is that you constantly need to be on a lookout and try to strike the proper balance. Forget about libertarian idea for a while and how that would work under the markets. The point is that we live in a certain time and a certain polity, which is the United States or Mexico here, and right now the pendulum has swung so far that it's actually counterproductive to the desires of the environmentalists. The people who are most responsible for climate change in the world today are the environmentalists. Had they not prevented nuclear expansion in the 1970s, most of the developed world today could be run in exactly the same fashion as that great paragon of free market economics, France, is today. The French get 85% of their electricity from nuclear fission. This is exactly what Britain, the United States, and the rest of the world could be run on, emitting no CO2 into the atmosphere.
Could you repeat that again? France, 85%?
Yeah, something like 80% of French electricity comes from nuclear reactors, fission reactors, which they built in the 1960s and the 1970s. Which is, of course, exactly when in the United States we started getting away from fission reactors, right? But imagine a world where the most advanced economies in the world, including increasingly China and India, were using nuclear fission, like France. We wouldn't be talking about climate change. There would be no climate change because we wouldn't be emitting almost any CO2 into the atmosphere. So the people who are to blame for where we are today are the environmentalists. They killed nuclear fission, or at least they postponed it for 40 years. Well, thank you.
There's... Un segundito, just a footnote on that, and it's not a question, it's just a footnote, but there's a big discussion in Latin America about fracking. And I don't think they understand the word correctly. I think it's too similar to another word that I won't mention here. And so therefore it's outlawed. So we've forbidden fracking here
Really?
in Mexico, and in Colombia there's a whole movement against fracking, and that it's anti-environmental. Of course, traditional old fossil fuels and the tremendous contamination that you see in many of our plants today, that's okay, but not fracking. And so perhaps there's a fundamental misunderstanding of a similar sort in that regard.
Well, yes. Again, the worst way that you can create energy is by burning oil to create electricity, like they did in the Middle East for many, many decades, or coal. They emit a lot of CO2 into the
Or
atmosphere.
Tula outside of Mexico City.
What is that?
That's a refinery.
Right. But if you replace it with natural gas is actually much cleaner than those things, and fission is even cleaner. So I would build natural gas power stations and a lot of nuclear power stations.
Allá arriba. Gracias.
Well, first, thank you very much for being here, Marian. Then, thank you very much, Roberto, for getting me here. I'm Bernardo from ITAM,
yeah.
student from ITAM. And I want to ask about public policies in Mexico. Now in some important talks of discussion. As a public policy analyst, which one you suggest is the best one from Mexico from 2024 until 2030, talking about fiscal terms in choosing between the contractive public policy or the expansive? Then my second question is which public policy you suggest for the next 6 years, 2030 to 2036?
I can't go into that many details. I'm not a Mexico specialist. I will tell you, and really make it very short, if I already said this with some other students here, if you are sitting on $1 billion in the United States and you want to spend it or invest it somewhere, Mexico would be ideal except for two things. One is insecurity of persons, perceived insecurity of persons, and the other one is the integrity of the judicial system and private property. Meaning, what I hear most people associate, most Americans associate with Mexico is high rates of violence, and then can you really rely on the political system and on judiciary to protect your investments so that you can take it back out again? And I think that with so many countries in the world at the level of Mexico or even lower in terms of GDP per capita, governments focus on all sorts of things while ignoring the most important things that the government should do to protect life, liberty, and private property. And I think that if you focus on that, then a lot more money will flow in Mexico and therefore stimulate your economy and create more growth and more rapid increases in incomes. Did that make sense?
Yeah, and especially considering the incredible opportunity that the nearshoring phenomenon is having in Mexico.
Yeah. Nearshoring is very important. Mexico has an opportunity here, but again, just stop focusing on if you focus on 1,000 things, then nothing is a priority.
Well, here, let me add to that example that you gave in Puebla, right? So sometimes politicians tend to think that once you've discovered a natural resource that's going to last forever. You talked about substitution and the importance of thinking in an innovative fashion about the power of substitution. So here, supposedly Mexico, especially in the state of Sonora, we have an enormous amount of lithium reserves. And the public policy response was to create a government monopoly to administrate lithium, even though lithium, being part of the subsoil, is already national ownership, is owned by the nation, so to speak. So there was actually no need to do that. Perhaps you could give a concession to exploit the lithium or whatnot. But this is thinking that, lithium is like a new gold or a new oil, and it's going to be there forever. And is it? You talked about other substitutes that could be much more efficient than lithium to power long-term batteries?
So as you know, lithium is incredibly important in the creation of electric batteries for electric vehicles. And as you know, the world is building more electric vehicles than ever before. What happened to the price of lithium in the last year? Anybody? It fell by 90%.
90%?
Yes. I enjoy speaking about lithium because my favorite politician in Latin America, President Boric of Chile, had a very similar idea, which is
And
to...
Cristina Kirchner in Argentina,
Yeah.
too.
This is the communist mindset. It's so primitive that it really beggars belief. Huge deposits of lithium in Chile. Boric's first reaction, let's create a national monopoly and we are going to be bringing billions of dollars. Same in Argentina, same in Mexico. Who is to say that the world will need lithium for electric car batteries in 20 years or even 10 years? What happens when the price of a commodity goes up? Everybody starts looking for new deposits of lithium, which is why the price has fallen by 90% in the last year. So now we are overflowing with lithium, and it turns out that sodium-ion batteries may be even better than lithium-ion batteries because they can be charged much faster, and because sodium is basically salt, right?
We have a lot of salt
which
here.
we have a lot. So you can now use sodium-ion probably in batteries in the next few years. Who knows what other great innovations are going to be produced in that particular sector.
López Obrador just announced a new salt para estatal here in Mexico.
So new deposits are being discovered, and of course there is absolutely no guarantee that electric vehicles will be needing lithium in 10 or even 20 years' time. So to tie your future economic prospects to this notion that we are going to become a lithium exporter is insane.
So in many countries, such as Mexico, child died of hunger, right? It's happening right now.
It's still happening in Mexico?
Of course, yeah. So how will you explain to one of those family what superabundance is?
Well, I mean, our work doesn't deny that there is a hardship in the world. Nor do I deny the possibility that some people in Mexico are so poor that they are actually starving. Although I am really surprised that in Mexico, which is a middle-income country, with a very heavy welfare state input, there are still people who cannot get enough food to have at least one meal a day. I'm really surprised by that. And I don't know what conditions or what part of the country, whether there is some sort of violence that prevents aid from getting there or whatever happens. But that doesn't change anything about the fact that on average, a typical Mexican is 70% better off than he or she was in 1980. The fact is that when you look at prices of commodities and you divide them by hourly income, it's still better than what it was in 1980. So the best I can do is to say Mexico is a much better country than it was in 1980. But it is not an ideal.
Or less worse.
Yeah. The key is just to persist and to make sure that next year is better than this year. It's pointless to try to compare Mexico to an ideal. That's how you get into problems.
But in terms of constructing a narrative between populism and other narratives that goes beyond populism and talk about innovation and human progress, how do those correct views of politics need to build those narratives?
That's a very important question, because that's the narrative, because that's at the heart of the dispute that we're having today in Mexico. The populist narrative that Jose Carlos is alluding to is one that promises heaven on earth tomorrow, instant redemption. I'm going to feed all of you. I'm going to be daddy government, el logro filantrópico of Octavio Paz. So how can we couch the innovation, the human progress, the superabundance narrative in a fashion that is able to neutralize the siren song of such populist promises?
Well, I don't think that there is a silver bullet, simply because, as I said, people are much more interested in negative news and therefore consuming the negative news and are consequently open to the siren call of populism. But what I try to do in Puebla when I was presenting the numbers about superabundance, I specifically focused on China, India, and then all the Latin American countries. Mexico came at the bottom. Again, you are 70% better off than you were in 1980, but you are still the worst performer out of Latin American countries for which we have data. So what I was hoping to do is that the people in the audience will look at the best performing Latin American country, which was Chile, and to say to themselves, hey, why can't we be more like Chile? You know, with its higher level of economic freedom and higher level of economic growth. So the part of it is aspirational, is to look at the countries which are doing the right things and ask, well, why can't we be like that? And that's what I hope people will get from that work, that it's possible to get from 70% increase in standard of living in Mexico to 4,000%, which was in China. Now, you're probably never going to get like 4,000% increase, or rather not in short to medium term, because China also has 1.5 billion people, 1.3 billion people, right? So it's a different type of market. But is it possible for Mexico to double its abundance? Yes, of course it's possible, and not in a very long time. That's what our data shows anyway.
¿Alguien más? Bueno, tenemos oportunidad ahorita de platicar one-on-one con Marian. Les quiero dar a todos las gracias por compartir su tiempo y sus conocimientos y sus ideas, sus inquietudes con nosotros en esta gran conversación con una persona que yo admiro profundamente, tanto a él como a su trabajo. No logramos hablar del proyecto de Human Progress, pero en humanprogress.org pueden ver, son una cantidad de historias que reflejan la idea de que pues, las cosas en varios aspectos están mucho mejor de lo que estaban hace 50 años, hace 100 años, hace 75 años, hace incluso 25 años. Los invito a conocer más de superabundancia, del proyecto de Human Progress. Este libro de 10 Trends es una absoluta maravilla, además la ilustración es muy hermosa. Y pues démosle las gracias a Marian Tupy por compartir su tiempo con nosotros. Marian, thank you so much for being here at
Pleasure.
Universidad de la Libertad. Irma, tenemos ahora un cóctel y canapés y oportunidad de hacer un conversatorio ya en términos mucho más informales. Los invitamos